Hey guys, today we have another game of Revised 40 from the March 2020 League. You can see myself on the left there piloting my blue-white control deck, and Dan on the right piloting his red-white control deck. So I'm on the play with a mulligan to 6, so after I bottom my card, I play a land for the turn and pass. Dan on his turn also plays a land and pass. So finally, after a 7-turn staring contest with the control mirror, the first spell of the game is a Disintegrate. Disintegrate is met with a Power Sink, countering the Disintegrate. In hindsight, this might have been a mistake. A Disintegrate for 6 isn't the biggest deal in the world, but not knowing what matchup you're up against, Disintegrate for 6 is something you would want to counter. So my opponent Dan on his turn playing a Fireball, another X costing burn spell, which is met with another Power Sink. Fireball, if there are creatures in play, you are allowed to pay more mana and split the damage between your opponent and any other targets that you want, as well as only targeting creatures. But in this case, it just goes all for the face. So main goals in this matchup, I am trying to keep counterspells in my hand for whatever Dan might resolve, and Dan is looking to try and burn me out with fireballs and disintegrates. So on the left there, I'm at 8 cards in hand, so I go to my discard step, discarding a Wrath of God since I haven't seen any creatures yet. And going to my discard again, discarding a Power Sink. Discarding counterspells this late in the game, something you don't want to see across the table, just means that your opponent has so many of them that they're discarding them. So Dan goes for another Fireball, and it's met with yet another Power Sink. Remember, in Revised 40, you're not limited to 4 copies of commons. So on my turn, I go for a Sarah Angel, and pass it back to Dan, leaving up double blue for counterspell. So Dan plays a Soul Ring for his turn, and a Swords to Plowshares on the Sarah Angel, which is met with a counterspell. Sarah Angel is one of the only threats in the blue-white control deck that I have going, so I would very much like it to live. And sadly, it is met with a Wrath of God after the counterspell, so Sarah Angel is destroyed. On my turn, I go for a Soul Ring and pass it back to Dan. Still just waiting to respond to whatever Dan might have in his hand. Dan on his turn is thinking about his options. He does have a lot of access to mana, so cards like Fireball and Disintegrate have the potential to deal a significant amount of damage. He decides to tap out for another X costing burn spell, this time an Earthquake. Earthquake is a rare that hits creatures as well as players. This is a lot of damage though, so it is met with a counterspell. The blue-white control list that I'm running runs 3 copies of Counterspell and 5 copies of Power Sink, since it is a common. So plenty of counterspells to go around. Dan on his turn tapping out for yet another Fireball, this time for 10 damage, which I do not have the counterspell for, so I fall to 10. On my turn, I tap 5 and play my second Sarah Angel and pass it back to Dan. Really hoping that this Sarah Angel is able to survive to start getting in for damage. Another Fireball or Disintegrate or even an Earthquake would be lethal at this point unless I have a counterspell for it, so very worried about that possibility. At this point though, there are 3 Swords to Plowshares in my deck that I haven't been able to use on any of Dan's creatures, so at least one of them is in my hand at this point. So if there was a Fireball or Disintegrate or some other X costing burn spell, I could respond to it by using Swords to Plowshares on my own Sarah Angel, since the controller does gain life equal to its power. So Dan on his turn deciding to almost tap out for a Fireball. He is deciding to split the damage between myself and the Sarah Angel, and in response, I do the Swords to Plowshares trick, using it on my own Sarah Angel to gain 4, putting myself at 14. and I play a Disenchant on Dan's Soul Ring. So take note that the Fireball also dealt 4 damage to me, which is why my life total didn't change. So a Fireball or a Disintegrate is still lethal in this case. Dan considering his options and tapping 2 for a Millstone. One of the lesser known finishers in Revised 40, Millstone can put cards from your opponent's deck into their graveyard, which is very relevant in a format with only 40 cards. So this Millstone can easily mill me out here. Especially in a deck like Blue-White Control, where you're potentially drawing more than 1 card a turn, Millstone can very quickly empty your entire library and win by the opponent attempting to draw off of an empty deck. So Dan counting his mana on the right side, never something that you want to see in a deck full of fireballs. He activates Millstone and flips over 2 lands. So it gets back to me, I pass the turn. Dan activates Millstone and flips a Wrath of God. Not doing a whole lot in this matchup. I still have not seen a single creature from Dan's side of the board. Dan's red-white control list plays a lot of fireballs and a lot of ways to handle creatures, but not many creatures of his own, so cards like Swords to Plowshares are almost blanks against Dan. I cast a Jayemdae Tome, and it's met with a Disenchant. I do not opt to draw a card off of it since I am fairly low on the number of cards in my deck. Dan activates the Millstone, milling a counterspell, and it looks like a balance. So really hoping to find a Disenchant for this Millstone, and hoping to look for a Brain Geyser to try and mill out my opponent. Brain Geyser, and there it is, going to the graveyard off the Millstone. So that is one of the only ways left in my deck that I have to win the game. The only other win con is Control Magic, and I haven't seen any creatures from Dan's side yet. So big game loss for milling that last Brain Geyser. So Millstone is activated and mills me out. I attempt to draw off an empty library, and the record is 0-1 in Dan's favor. Alright, moving into game number 2, I'm on the play on the left side, and I lead with an island and pass. So, the same thing as the first game, we are just starting with a lot of land go. We are both playing control decks, but the difference this time is that we each know what each other is playing this time around. So, using things like Counterspell on burn spells might be less appealing in this game. So you can see we're already at turn 4, not a single spell has been cast. And the first spell of the game is a Serra Angel on my side. Serra Angel, I'm hoping will live through this time, but unfortunately Dan does have access to 5 mana, which is enough for a Fireball or something like Wrath of God to kill the Angel. And passes back to me. I draw my card for the turn, play out my land, and just pass it back to Dan. Still just sitting on counter spells, hoping that Dan will play something that I can respond to. So I play a 7th land and a second Serra Angel, this time with double blue up so that I can have counterspell backup. Knowing what I'm playing, Dan definitely knows this, so he has to try and answer it in a way that I can't stop with a single counterspell. So he decides to go for the second Wrath of God, which is of course met with a counterspell. This keeps Serra Angel in play for at least a little bit longer. So Dan, knowing that if it gets back to my turn, I'll just have counterspells up forever, trying to think of a way to deal with Serra Angel, and eventually decides to use 2 lightning bolts to finish it off. Dan's deck really showing its versatility here, how it can hit either creatures or players with its burn spells. So things like Lightning Bolt and Fireball can either be used as removal or finishers. Dan thinking about his options on his turn and goes for an Earthquake for 5 damage. There are no creatures in play, so it just deals 5 damage to both players. Dan plays that Millstone again. That's the alternate win con for the Fireball deck, which is met with a Power Sink. Power Sink counters the Millstone unless Dan pays 5, and since he's unable to, he's forced to tap out. Note that Power Sink does not actually cause mana burn, since the mana is emptied from the pool, so when you pass phases, there's no mana left in the pool. Dan considering his options and going for a Disintegrate, dealing 5 damage to me. And I pass the turn back to Dan. Here we can see another Disintegrate for 5, putting me down to just 5 life. So another Fireball or Disintegrate would be lethal at this point, as would another copy of Earthquake. There's a second Millstone from Dan as the alternate win con, trying to mill me out. I decide not to counter this one since the more pressing threat would be a Fireball. Dan activates Millstone, and I flip a Control Magic and a Swords to Plowshares into the graveyard. Neither of these cards really doing anything in this matchup since I still have not seen a single creature from Dan. Dan goes for the Fireball for the kill, and I do have the Power Sink to counter it. So there's a Disenchant on the Millstone from me, trying to put off the milling of my library. Dan goes for a second lethal Fireball. And I have another Power Sink to counter it. Getting a bit nervous on the left there. I am going to run out of counterspells eventually, and Dan seems to have no shortage of Fireballs. So being at 5 life is a very bad spot to be in. There's the third Fireball in 3 turns, which is met with a counterspell. Dan passing back to me. I draw my card for the turn. Still not really able to do a whole lot on the blue-white side of things. This might be a change I might have to make to this deck. It typically expects the opponent to have some creatures so that it can either control magic or hit with Swords to Plowshares, so there are a lot of dead cards in my blue-white list. I pass the turn back to Dan. He draws his card for the turn, still looking for that last Fireball or Disintegrate to finish me off. He goes for the lethal Fireball, and that's the game. So no fourth counterspell for Fireball. You can see lots of creature removal just stranded in my hand since Dan's deck doesn't have any creatures. So Dan takes the win with a 2-0 record. Let's take a look at our most valuable cards for this matchup. In first, we have Fireball and its little brothers Disintegrate and Earthquake. These X-costing burn spells doing a lot of work this game, both in taking out cards like Sarah Angel and just dealing lethal damage. And runner-ups, we have Power Sink and Millstone. Power Sink helping to try and keep threats off the table, and Millstone taking down Game 1 as the secondary win con. If you do want to see deck techs for either of these decks, or more Revised 40 games like this, be sure to check out the Revised 40 playlist. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.